Finovate showcases cutting-edge banking and financial technology through a global conference series featuring short-form demos and thought leadership. Now, the conversation continues on the Finovate podcast.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Finovate podcast. Joining me today, we have Manas Chawla, CEO of London Politica. Manas is going to be joining us on stage at FinovateFall this year in New York. We had a great session with him at Finovate Spring. Manas, thank you so much for joining me today.
Greg, thank you so much for having me. I love working with the Finovate family, and I'm excited about New York.
Yeah, well, certainly we all learned a lot from your session last spring in San Francisco. But before we jump into some of those pieces, can you start by just telling us a little bit about yourself and London Politica?
Sure. So I founded and I now currently lead London Politica, which is the world's largest geopolitical risk advisory for social impact. And when we first entered the space about 3.5 years ago, there were very few political risk companies doing things on social impact. And so the first few clients we worked with were anything to do with charities, nonprofits, international organizations, really the kinds of organizations that work on the frontiers of geopolitically risky markets, but often don't have the budgets to pay for the premium price tag, which existed in that sort of industry. And that led to some cool projects. We got to work with the United Nations World Food Program in Afghanistan, helping them figure out the geopolitics of local instability and helping them redesign more effective food programs after the United States pulled out. We got to work with the Red Cross, and we were their exclusive partner in Ukraine, helping them figure out how the war was evolving, both sort of in a macro long-term scale, but also on the ground, day to day, week to week. I got to spend a few weeks in Poland and Ukraine last summer, and that was very informative. And then over time, we shifted to a much more sort of commercial focus and started providing that macro advice to all sorts of entities, from big banks, hedge funds, private equity. We do a lot of family offices, and of course to fintech companies, which, often because they're so young and so fast moving, geopolitical risk isn't high on their agenda. But as I try to point out in San Francisco, and will try to do in New York, I think it really should be, because I think not only are there a lot of risks, but plenty of opportunities for fintechs to look out for.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, certainly the background that you have is really interesting and very different from most of the guests who come on this podcast. I think it's really beneficial, though, for fintechs and for financial institutions to turn their lens towards this bigger picture, because obviously a lot of geopolitical events will have massive impact on the banking and the fintech space. And I think I think every industry is guilty of this to some extent, but I think the fintech industry in particular, we've got a bubble around ourselves. And so sometimes there's a temptation to ignore some of those larger pieces that are obviously going to have a major impact on the space. Now, I don't want you to give away too much about what you're going to be talking about in New York, but can you talk a little bit about some of the big geopolitical events that you're seeing unfold or that might unfold that you think might have a big impact on the banking and fintech spaces?
Sure. I mean, I think these last 5 years, in kind of a longer term, in the last year in particular, have proven that geopolitical risk is here and it's here to stay. There used to be a time when geopolitical risk wasn't a mainstay at conferences like these, but now it's really, really hard to ignore. The war in Ukraine has affected virtually every business and every industry in some way, shape, or form or the other. But you're also seeing sort of more long-term trends. If you're seeing what's happening with the macroeconomic environment and this sort of inflation that central banks all around the world are struggling to overcome, if you're looking at how deeply interconnected our supply chains are to one to three particular choke points in Taiwan, where 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors are made. And if you think about the kind of potential of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, which 10 years ago people almost didn't think about. Now the best analysts I've seen rated at somewhere between 50 to 75% in the next 3 years. When you think about all those things, it really makes you understand how fundamentally insecure, fragile, and unstable the geopolitical environment we're in. And that obviously creates a lot of risks, but it also creates opportunities. One of the most interesting pieces of the puzzle, I think, for fintechs to keep track of is the evolving pattern of central bank-backed digital currencies. Now, effectively, every major central bank in the world is thinking of issuing a digital currency, but by far the country most ahead in this race is China. And they've already started trialing these currencies. They've rolled it out to about a quarter of their citizens, which is, sort of in the neighborhood of 300 to 500 million people. And this poses massive concerns, privacy concerns on one level, but also concerns about the ethics of an authoritarian government having access to how every individual spends their money on a day-to-day basis. And particularly as we see US-China relations intensify and heat up, we see this bifurcation between the tech systems we have. We're developing two different systems simultaneously that don't talk to each other. There's different American tech companies and different Chinese tech companies. And I think a real concern is that that spreads to the bifurcation of financial systems, of fintech systems, which certainly poses, again, both risks and opportunities for fintech. So those are just some of the things I would watch out for, but there's plenty more.
Yeah, now certainly no shortage of pieces that you could potentially have listed off there, but the ones you have picked were, I think, really, really good to focus on. Now, one of the things that we were kind of talking about before we push record is the idea. Obviously, big geopolitical events can impact the fintech industry, but we're now kind of seeing that go the other way as well, where the fintech industry is now playing a role in the outcome of some of these big geopolitical events. Can you talk a little bit about how the fintech industry is able to influence some of these pieces that you've been talking about? Not necessarily the exact examples that you just listed, but how it's able to kind of become increasingly a factor on this international stage.
Sure. I mean, we've seen this. This isn't a new story. We've seen this post 2007-8, when a lot of the surviving big financial institutions had immense government relations teams and had immense influence within the agenda setting process of policymaking for the years to come. And I think that slowly evolved into the same reality, only more so for big tech companies. And if you look across the landscape of American tech companies, whether that's Google, Meta, Microsoft, or Apple, all of these have dedicated government relations teams, but in certain cases, entire teams called digital diplomacy. Speaking of Microsoft in particular, which has a permanent office and a permanent presence to the UN, both in New York and Geneva. And you might think that these tech companies are largely trying to influence the agenda on tech things, on AI, on regulation, on the future of work. And while they are doing that, they're also moving into completely traditional areas of geopolitics. Microsoft, for instance, is the largest private donor to the UN High Commission on Refugees in 1 year. And so there's very clear agendas and priorities for tech companies. That's less so the case with fintechs, partly because we don't have fintechs yet the size of these sort of bigger tech companies, but also because most fintechs haven't actually woken up to the reality of geopolitics being a sphere of influence that they can play an active role in. And so largely, while I think fintechs have made some important moves, and there's some interesting examples, at least in Europe, of fintechs influencing regulation at the EU, at the kind of with domestic authorities on very particular things, I think it's a very decisive time for fintech thought leaders to play a role in thinking about the future of money, the future of debt, the future of lending, and really try to influence governments and civil society in accordance with that, whether that's on central banking and central bank-backed digital currencies or on other spheres. So there's certainly immense opportunities, yeah.
Yeah, I think we've kind of seen that as well. The beginnings of it anyway. There have been these moments where the fintech community, I think, has sort of had to step up, or at least maybe seen an opportunity to step up in the wake of COVID. Obviously, with the PPP loans, there were a huge number of fintechs who were jumping in to help facilitate that process and make the loan application process much more easy for the folks who are actually filling it out, tracking it. And we saw different countries doing very different things. I had the Minister of Finance from Singapore on the show talking about how they were really quickly able to, through the fintech rails that they had built, distribute stimulus money into various sectors of the economy in an extremely targeted way, which obviously is not something that I think the fintech industry would have said we're going to do this. But when faced with that challenge, they had the means to go out and do it. And so now I think the challenge is to say, okay, we built a system which is resilient enough to be able to handle problems as they come up, but can you think one step further? Can you start to anticipate the problems a little bit sooner? Can you start to think about how you might be able to influence the spheres beyond sort of crisis management mode? And that was something you actually talked a little bit about on stage at Spring as well. You mentioned the concept not of a black swan, which I think many people are probably aware of, but of a gray rhino. Can you talk a little bit about what exactly a gray rhino is and how it kind of relates to a lot of the conversation we've been having so far?
Yeah, I mean, a black swan is a word that we used very, very regularly, especially post 2007 and 8, really to justify 2007 and 8 as this kind of crisis that was entirely unforeseeable, and that we could only rationalize with the benefit of hindsight. Effective black swans are very rare events that have massive impacts. But in contrast, gray rhinos actually develop right in front of our eyes. You can see a gray rhino. There's no way you could miss it. And it charges really slowly at you at first, but you only really start to act or realize it when it's right in front of you. And similar to black swans, they can have massive societal impacts. And I think a lot of the crises that'll define the next decade of geopolitics and macroeconomics aren't even necessarily ones we can't predict. We probably can. It's just that they're developing so slowly. There's a fundamental inertia and complacency in how we act about them. And so, as a couple of quick examples, the fact that all the world's electronics and technology are so heavily dependent on what is effectively one or two supply chains of advanced semiconductors in Taiwan. Everyone knows that. And everyone knows that a Chinese invasion is possible. But what really are companies doing to create contingency plans around what would happen when such a geopolitical event takes place? Or say it's not geopolitical, where the raw materials come from for these semiconductors, which is largely based out of South Korea and Japan, and where they're processed in Taiwan, both of those regions sit on key tectonic fault lines. So the risk of an earthquake is very high. I mean, something like a kind of mid-level earthquake, a natural disaster, could entirely disrupt global supply chains in all parts of the world. And there's very few companies, again, that have really started thinking about those sorts of risks.
Yeah, well, I think it's because it's so difficult to think about, but that's also why it's so crucial to spend some time thinking about them. And as someone who I have a story for another day. I was actually one time literally charged by a gray rhino while I was on safari. I can tell you they do come up on you quick in the last 50 feet or so, and so it's something which I think there's a lot to be aware of. I think the question then becomes, what can bankers and what can fintech professionals do? What do they need to be doing right now that they're not already doing? Because when you lay it out in this way, it seems so obvious, right? That there needs to be some safeties built in. There needs to be some contingency plans built in. It's not something which you can just ignore. So what do you recommend in the part of actually kind of changing behavior from what you're seeing now in the space?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of really big things, and these things might sound very basic, but I'd argue actually that very few institutions actually really implement them rigorously in the way they need to. But one of these things is treating geopolitical risk like a priority. I think in the kind of regulatory environment we're coming into post 2007-8, and particularly in the fintech space where the regulatory environment is constantly changing, companies have huge compliance teams. And often all the subparts of risk, including geopolitics, gets relegated to them. And it's something often that C-suite leadership and the board can almost shrug off. And that shouldn't be the case if you're looking at geopolitical risk as a really real operational concern. Because if that's the case, which it is, then C-suite leadership and boards should spend time thinking about this as a crucial part of their agenda, and should think about how different geopolitical events could potentially be risks, but also opportunities and spaces to expand the business in. And then the second thing is that there's no shortage of geopolitical risks in the short term that are very scary that the media bombards us with constantly and all the time. But often they pose the risk of us losing sight of the long-term geopolitical risks, which potentially, and I'd argue definitely, are even more pivotal in changing society and the kind of global structure and world order as a whole. If you think about where emerging markets are going in the next 5 to 10 years, if you think about the pace of digitization, if you think about democratic blacksliding, you think about how important the influence of big tech companies has become as geopolitical actors of their own. These are huge things that banks can, again, are much like gray rhinos that fintechs should focus on. But again, because they're so far into the long term, often we lose sight of them. And so, second thing is to make sure that those are constantly on top of our agenda.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that you can see now that the fintech industry is old enough that you can see companies who've done a good job of this historically do tend to be the ones who come and succeed later on. A lot of the companies that we think of as juggernauts right now in the fintech space have been just slightly ahead of the curve, both in understanding what's likely to happen, what's likely to drive consumer behavior, and also understanding how the geopolitical landscape might potentially shift. And I think we're seeing that obviously regulators play a role in determining in a very literal sense what happens in the fintech and banking spheres, but also consumers have evolved quite a bit. And I'm not going to say anybody anticipated exactly what happened in 2020 with the pandemic, but there were a lot of companies who had prior to that in 2018 and 2019 really started to understand we need to be able to meet customers wherever they are. All of a sudden, overnight, that became crucial. And a huge number of companies benefited enormously in 2020 and 2021. And a lot of companies were on the exact other side, where things that they had put in place were not resilient enough to withstand that kind of stress test. And so I think that's really the crucial piece. There's a lot more that we could talk about here, and I would encourage anybody who's interested in hearing more from Manas to come to FinovateFall, listen to him speak there. Obviously, also check out the demoing companies that we'll have on stage and see for yourself who among the group could potentially be one of these leaders in the next 5 or 10 years, could turn into one of those juggernauts. It absolutely can happen. It's happened before. And for my part, I'll just say I always love chatting with you, and I'm really interested in hearing what you're going to be talking about. Look forward to catching up with you in New York.
It's been a real pleasure, Greg. I look forward to seeing you in New York.
The Finovate podcast is produced by Informa Connect in association with Provoke.fm Media. Check out Finovate.com for information on Finovate's upcoming shows and to learn how you can get involved. The discount code Finovate Podcast will save you 20% on tickets to all of our events. And you can email us at info@finovate.com for information on sponsoring, speaking, or demoing. Thanks for listening.